I believe we're in a kind of end stage right now. It's a very dramatic moment. Maybe our mainstream media don't fully appreciate it, but we have some crucial decisions to make just in the next weeks. Here's why. Ukraine is in terrible trouble. The counteroffensive has failed. The devastation to Ukraine has been immense. It's really been a bloodbath. Ukraine has been worn down terribly by this failed counteroffensive with massive loss of people and a massive loss of hardware. And Russia is probably going to launch a major counteroffensive and a very dangerous one very soon. That's not for sure, but I think that is likely. And I think the consequences for everybody, starting with Ukraine and Europe and the world, could be very, very grave if we don't move to negotiation now to save Ukraine first and foremost. Now, my view has been all along that this was a war that could have been avoided at many points, that it is a war caused basically by the U.S. idea of expanding NATO to Ukraine and even to Georgia on the eastern edge of the Black Sea. It's an old U.S. idea. It's even an older British idea because it was basically the British imperial idea of the Crimean War to remove Russian power from the Black Sea. And Brzezinski in the 1990s revived this idea, and our neoconservatives in the United States have tried to put it into place for more than 25 years. So this is a war that has deep roots in U.S. Unilateralism and neoconservatism. This is not how the war is portrayed in our media, which absolutely deny people the history that they need. As everybody knows, I'm sure, in this room, Hans Dietrich Genscher and James Baker were very explicit with President Gorbachev. NATO will not move eastward. The United States cheated. Germany went along with it. And the eastward expansion of NATO started under Clinton, and it accelerated under George Bush, with 7 new NATO members in 2004. But the huge, decisive moment was pushing Ukraine's membership in NATO at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008. And we know that Chancellor Merkel was very much against this, as were most of the European leaders. But frankly, European leaders don't stand up to the United States, just like your chancellor today never stands up to the United States, I'm afraid. And so when the U.S. pushed for a commitment for NATO enlargement to Ukraine and Georgia, even though the European leaders knew this was deeply dangerous and misguided, and our own U.S. diplomats knew that this was dangerous and misguided, NATO went ahead with this commitment because the U.S. pressured all the rest of the leaders. And so Ukraine's membership in NATO was promised. This has proved to be devastating for Ukraine. When Yanukovych became president in 2010, he wisely called for neutrality. And neutrality was passed by the Rada, and it became the state law. Then, of course, as you know, the neocons in the United States aimed to overthrow Yanukovych. And however you depict the Maidan Revolution of Dignity. It was a U.S. regime change operation to a significant extent. This is obvious for anybody that cares to look. Again, our media deny the obvious. It happens that Russia intercepted a call of Victoria Nuland that explains it all, because 3 weeks before the violent coup that overthrew Yanukovych, Victoria Nuland was already choosing the new government of Ukraine. So as soon as Yanukovych was overthrown, President Putin retook Crimea so that Sevastopol, the naval base of Russia since 1783, would not fall into NATO hands. And to break away regions of Ukraine, rejected the coup-led government, which was a Russophobic Western Ukrainian government, hostile to Russian ethnic Ukrainians. And these two provinces broke away, Donetsk and Lugansk, and violence broke out. The war started in 2014. And of course, the Minsk agreements were negotiated to stop the war. And Germany and France were the guarantors of the Minsk agreement. But as even Chancellor Merkel told us in interviews last year, nobody took the Minsk agreement seriously in the West. Russia took it seriously, but neither Ukraine, nor Germany, nor the United States, nor France took it seriously. And so the autonomy that was promised for the Donbass was not followed through by the Ukrainian governments. Instead, the United States started to arm a massive army, beginning really with the arms buildup in 2018 and 2019. And this army threatened, as your generals have made clear, to storm the Donbass in 2021 and early 2022. This is the truth. This is not Putin propaganda or Putin apology. This is the U.S. neoconservatives pushing NATO against Russia's red lines and knowing that war would come from this. Even there's a video of Zelensky's senior advisor, Arestovich, in 2019, very clearly saying, we know that pursuing NATO means war with Russia, but we're ready for war with Russia. So we knowingly provoked this war because of this desire to end Russia's great power status by surrounding Russia in the Black Sea region. And the plan all along was that Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia would completely surround Russia and the Black Sea. And this would, in the theory of Brzezinski and going back to the 19th century, make it impossible for Russia to project its power in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. On December 17, 2021, as you know, President Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement to avert the war. And the agreement called for several things, but the most important was an end to NATO enlargement. I personally called the White House after that agreement was put onto the table and really urged President Biden to negotiate. But the U.S. position, and it is the formal NATO position, is that NATO enlargement is none of Russia's business. This is the so-called open door policy, that only NATO and the counterpart, in this case Ukraine, have any say in NATO enlargement, and Russia's interests have no bearing whatsoever. This is sheer reckless arrogance. That's America for you. And this is how we get into wars, because we refused to negotiate over the expansion of NATO. Now, mind you, think of the context in which Russia viewed this. First, the United States had unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002, and the United States was putting missiles into Central and Eastern Europe, starting with Poland and Romania. Russia vociferously objected. The United States said it's none of your business. The U.S., of course, launched wars repeatedly. Serbia, 1999, Afghanistan, 2001, Iraq, 2003, Syria, 2011, Libya, 2011, Ukraine, 2014, with the violent overthrow of Yanukovych. The U.S. refused to negotiate on any of these matters. The U.S. unilaterally built a massive army in Ukraine. This is what Russia saw and faced in early 2022. I'm just explaining this war. I'm not justifying it, I'm explaining it. We walked eyes open into a war. Of course, the United States thought that the sanctions regime, that cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system would bring down the Russian economy. This was stupid, but this was the belief of senior U.S. officials. Senior U.S. officials thought that Putin would not mobilize in Russia, that he would be politically too weak. This was, again, extraordinarily naive, because from Russia's point of view, this question of NATO enlargement is an existential question. It's not just a minor point. It's an existential question. So the United States provoked this war. Putin launched the special military operation. Within 2 weeks, Zelensky called for negotiations based on Ukraine's neutrality. And as you know, at the end of March, there was actually a document about to be signed by Russia and Ukraine based on neutrality, and that would have ended the war. The United States intervened and stopped that agreement. Do you read about it in the mainstream media? No. But this is what happened. And I've spoken to the negotiators, and I flew to Ankara to get a proper briefing about all of this. And I've spoken to many people about this. And the United States blocked this because the United States said to Zelensky, you can defeat Russia. You don't have to accept neutrality, because this project of NATO enlargement was the project of Biden, Nuland, Blinken, and Sullivan. And your government has stood up and cheered all the way, especially your foreign minister, as has much of Europe. It's very sad. Now, what was clear from the beginning is that the sanctions would not crush the Russian economy or prevent Russia from prosecuting this war. It was also clear from the beginning that the so-called wonder weapons of NATO would not be sufficient if Russia chose to fight a war of attrition, because Russia is much larger than Ukraine, because Russia's military-industrial complex is even proportionately larger than Ukraine's. And because for Russia, this was not a small issue where Putin was just going to go away. This was an existential issue. And so again, our generals so frequently do exactly what they've done in Ukraine. All my life, U.S. generals have said victory is just around the corner. They said it in Vietnam. They said it in Iraq. They said it in Libya. They said it in Syria. They said it in Afghanistan. And they said it in Ukraine. Don't worry, everything's under control. But clearly, where we are today, nothing is under control. Ukraine has suffered grievously on the battlefield and in the destruction of infrastructure and in the flight of 10 million people or more, and in the annexation of vast territory with many millions more, and with so many dead and wounded each day and week. And the United States just keeps saying, keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting. And you know, our senators have the audacity to say, we're getting our money's worth because no Americans are dying, we're weakening Russia, and we're showing China that we're strong. This is actually what grown-ups in the United States say. It's hideous. How can a senator say such a thing? So profoundly immoral and so profoundly stupid, by the way. Russia's not being weakened by this. Russian military is being strengthened by this. We're not showing China how tough we are. We're depleting our arsenals and showing that Russia can take on the NATO military armaments and hold them at bay. And what does fighting in Ukraine with hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians conceivably have to do with showing China that we're tough? The very idea is appalling. But actually, I'm quoting the senior members of the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee of the U.S. Senate. This is the line that actually the politicians in Washington use, that this is about China. And in the meantime, Ukraine is in desperate shape. Now, let me say that the situation is even more adverse because the awfulness of this is dawning on more and more people. In the elections yesterday, or today, I guess, yesterday or today, because it's time zone difference, in Slovakia, yesterday's election, sorry, a government was just brought to power that ran the campaign on the basis of stopping all support for Ukraine. Poland has announced it's stopping all support for Ukraine. Hungary, of course, has opposed this adventure all along, saying that this was a neocon illusion, not some pro-Ukrainian initiative. So Ukraine is losing its support in Europe one by one. There is not a senior politician in a Western European country that has an approval rating higher than the disapproval rating. Western European politicians are all unpopular. This war is deeply unpopular. The economic boomerang effects are deeply unpopular. What this has done to the German economy is deeply unpopular. And the US blowing up Nord Stream didn't help. So Europe has pulled back. Then, ladies and gentlemen, you probably saw that the United States Congress rejected Biden's call for more financial support for Ukraine in the last-minute maneuvers yesterday that kept the U.S. government functioning with this so-called continuing resolution. That's a kind of stopgap legislation that is passed to keep the government going for another couple of months while the deeper budget debate continues. But President Biden was trying to put in $6 billion of short-term help for Ukraine into that continuing resolution. And it failed. In fact, the continuing resolution succeeded only when the money for Ukraine was taken off the table. And this is because the Republican Party in the United States, both in the base of the membership of the party in the United States and increasingly in the leaders of the party in Washington, are opposed to more spending for Ukraine. Now, they have mixed reasons for this. Some is fiscal policy. Some is that they want to spend the money to fight China, not to fight Russia. Some just don't believe in the war. There's a mixed set of motives, but the Republicans do not want to fund this war anymore, and the Republicans control the lower house of our Congress. So that's another reality. So if you add this up, Ukraine having lost in its counteroffensive, losing support in Europe, losing support in the United States, and facing the prospect of a massive offensive by Russia, that's still only a hypothesis, but it's a possible one. What to do? Well, if you are Britain, it's clear. Britain says we should escalate. Britain is sending British military to Ukraine now for on-site training. The British, in my view, are a little crazy, still with the nostalgia for their empire, still fighting the first Crimean War, they think. So I try to put this British view away because it is a nonsense and a danger. What we need to do is not to escalate further, which could end up with the full destruction of Ukraine or an escalation to nuclear war, as we know. We need to understand that all of this all along has fit Clausewitz's famous formulation that war is the continuation of politics with other means. We need to face the politics of this issue. This is a war over NATO enlargement and an internal war between Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine. And the way that could have kept Ukraine safe and secure would have been neutrality and diversity, a federal structure for Ukraine, recognizing the Russian language and Russian culture, and not having a culture conflict as well as a NATO enlargement. But we've gotten the worst of both worlds, pushing NATO enlargement and a Russophobic Western Ukrainian regime absolutely spewing hate, maybe understandable, but hate against Russia that is totally destructive of peace prospects. So we need to come back to the politics. And in my mind, the politics are roughly the following. I think that there are at least four components to a peace agreement. The first and fundamental one is stop NATO enlargement eastward. Stop already. This is so dangerous and provocative. And it's, since Ukraine's not going to join NATO, to keep promising that it will, when the war is over, means perpetual war or outright defeat of Ukraine. So stop NATO enlargement. Stop this absurdity of this so-called open door policy. Understand that NATO enlargement does concern Russia, and that Russia should have a say in this. And that we should remember the promises that Genscher and Kohl and Baker made back in 1990. Anyway, this whole approach has been wrong, driven by U.S. unipolar aspirations. So the first point is stop the NATO enlargement as part of a peace agreement. The second is very difficult now, what to do about the territories. You know, in 2014, Russia wasn't claiming any territories. Then Yanukovych was overthrown, and Russia, it just claimed the Minsk II agreement. But then the Minsk II agreement was repudiated, so Russia claimed the territory of the Donbass. We keep refusing common sense, and the situation keeps getting worse and worse. At this point, there does need to be border change negotiated. And we have to understand that sometimes borders do change. The United States forced a border change of Serbia to put Kosovo out of Serbia. That was a NATO operation, bombing Belgrade for 49 straight days in order to change the border. And the United States did the same with Sudan, siding with the insurgency of South Sudan to change the border. So we're going to have to negotiate borders to reach peace. Crimea certainly is going to remain in Russian hands. The heavy Russian ethnic populations of Ukraine are going to be in Russian hands in the end if we want peace. So that's a second point that I think is obvious. A third point is the United States and Russia need to get back to nuclear arms negotiations. The U.S. never should have abandoned the ABM treaty. The U.S. never should have abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which it did in 2019. Now the New START treaty is in suspension. We need the nuclear negotiations to resume. And the United States has to accept that Russia is right, actually, about this danger of the placement of Aegis missiles without negotiating with Russia. This is destabilizing the nuclear situation. So that's a third plank that is needed. And a fourth plank is to return to the concept of collective security of the OSCE. Because the OSCE is based specifically on the point that no country can choose a military alliance in a way that endangers another country. Unlike the NATO open door doctrine, so-called, that NATO doesn't have to talk to Russia, the whole OSCE is premised on collective security, that no country can take measures that jeopardize a neighboring country. And this is the right point. OSCE is truly Europe's best path for security. I should mention, by the way, that while I was against NATO enlargement all along, I would be very clear, NATO will not retreat from where it is, but it will stop expanding. NATO should not, in these negotiations, leave the Baltic states or leave Romania or Bulgaria or others. No, it can't do that. But it can accept that it will stop the Eastern enlargement. Finally, let me say that while it seems impossible today, I firmly believe that normal relations with Russia should be established between Germany and Russia, and in fact between the European Union and Russia. And by normal relations, I mean trade and finance and tourism and culture. this idea that we are siding to never again speak with Russia or listen to Rachmaninoff or play a Tchaikovsky ballet or have a Russian soprano sing in our opera houses is reprehensible, in my view. What are we doing? We made a terrible political mistake to go deeper and deeper into conflict with Russia rather than operating with respect and actually with consistency. We crossed Russia's red lines knowingly and repeatedly. We overthrew a government in Ukraine. We don't admit any of this, by the way, in the mainstream media. I'm attacked every day for simply repeating the historical truths. So be it. I don't care. These are the truths. And this is the way to peace. We need to understand this is politics, and we need to return to politics. This issue will not be solved. Ukraine will not be saved on the battlefield. Thank you very much.
Because I think we've covered a lot of ground for ASEAN, and we've heard a lot of things that are very promising. And that's good, because we need some optimism and some direction for how to overcome some of the big challenges right now. If we were to step back from our crises and look at some of the very fundamental trends in the world, we'd have a great deal of reason for optimism, in fact. The world economy and world society as a whole has become much better off than it was 100 years ago, without question. Life expectancy has risen remarkably. Income in the world, on average, is now $20,000 per person if measured at international prices, and about $12,000 per person if measured at market prices. And this is a huge rise of incomes and well-being and quality of diets, protection of healthcare coverage, and many, many other really fundamental parts of our material life. And what Dr. Zhao described for China, which is absolutely incredible, for 1.4 billion people over a period of 40 years, has been achieved not quite at that pace, but very broadly in many parts of the world. And the underlying reason for those improvements is that science, technology, know-how has advanced and continues to advance even at an accelerating rate. So our ability to address practical challenges is really unprecedented right now. Our wealth is unprecedented, and our know-how is unprecedented. This is really the fundamental reason for being very optimistic about what we can do and what we should do in the coming years. What we've learned, though, is that there are at least three fundamental problems with the way the world functions. And that's what brings us to this workshop and what brings us to the Sustainable Development Goals. The first is that with all that progress, there are billions of people that have been effectively left behind this progress, that are really struggling for a variety of reasons. People live in more remote areas or in very unfavorable geographies, or are part of minority groups that have been maltreated within societies, or half the population, women and girls, that traditionally were not part of the market economy. We're part of the household economy and have definitely seen progress, but facing a lot of social obstacles still today, which is why one of the Sustainable Development Goals is directed specifically at the issues of gender, SDG 5. So one of the three huge challenges is that we have a rich world and a lot of very poor and suffering people within that world. And that's just, I think for most of us, humanly unacceptable. And indeed, when the UN was established in 1948, all of the member states agreed that there should be basic standards of life for every person on the planet because they're people on the planet, because they're human beings. And the world is productive enough to ensure the dignity of everybody. And that's why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. And I regard us still trying to honor that declaration, which seems to me to be the basic point. So problem number one is the very uneven development, the fact that there is still today a significant part of the world that lives in really abject deprivation. And that's a first challenge. And I think it's ethically probably the number one challenge, because extreme deprivation in a world of plenty is absolutely destructive of all of our humanity if we don't solve that problem. So that's why SDG 1 is end extreme poverty. Straightforward. And SDG 2, the second highest priority, is end hunger, for heaven's sake. Of course, there are big challenges of how to do it, but I will say in a world of wealth and knowledge, this is definitely within reach. It's crazy, to my mind, that if the average income is $12,000 per capita, there are people living at a few $100s per capita, and the world just goes on as they suffer and die young and face terrible hardships. The second big challenge, the huge challenge, the puzzle that is even harder than the first one conceptually, is that we discovered about 50 years ago that the nature of our economic development, all that wealth that I just talked about, is environmentally destructive, because the much vaunted economic processes don't take care of their physical byproducts. And some of them were not understood till 50 or 100 years ago, like greenhouse gases and their effects on climate. That required a scientific breakthrough of a quite deep order to understand that. It came by the end of the 19th century, and then it took at least 75 years to create measurement systems to verify the science. And we've more or less known from around 1980 that humanity is really changing the climate in ways that could be dangerous. And we're still struggling with that fact, because what brought us that wealth in the first place, starting in the 1800s, was fossil fuels. And then we discovered about halfway through, oh, those are dangerous. That's not good. So this is the second big problem, is that we have an economic system and a set of laws, rules, regulations, a global commons, the open seas, and many other factors of our economic system that mean that the scale of production is now self-destructive. And as I say, we've understood this intellectually at least for about 50 years. It was 50 years ago that the first conference on this fact took hold. It was 51 years ago that the first good book about this, Limits to Growth, was written and made clear that there was a real problem. And we've not finished solving that problem. But let me stipulate the following, just like I did for the first one. There's nothing fundamental about these environmental challenges that is beyond our solution, even with our current knowledge base. In other words, we already in 2023 have the range of technical solutions to 90% of the greenhouse gases, not 100%. We definitely don't face a choice between food and nature. We face a choice between destructive and non-destructive forms of food production. That's a very different choice. I haven't found in 40 years of my work on this a fundamental barrier to economic well-being and environmental sustainability. So I'm not in the degrowth school of thought, which says that what we really need is to reverse economic development. Not all economic development is good for human well-being. That's a different matter. But I'm not of the school of thought that says we've created a kind of society that is completely inconsistent with our environmental necessities or our environmental well-being or health. What we have is a very flawed economic system, legal system, regulatory system, incentive structure, so that we adopt or continue with technologies that are very ill-advised and do lots of stupid things because it's possible to make money off of those stupid things rather than do the things that we should be doing. And I've not seen in all of my experience any calculations that show me that doing the right things is beyond our reach, beyond our budget, beyond our economic means. For example, all of the estimates about the energy transformation to a zero carbon energy system suggest that it's 1 or 2% of world output that is needed to make that change. That's really strange. It's not that it's 50% of world output that's needed. It's not that this is cataclysmically expensive and we're just doomed as if an asteroid were coming to hit the planet and we have nothing to do. No, we have clear, very, very clear things to do. Sometimes we have too many possible things to do, so we don't know which one to take, so we're paralyzed. Should we do wind or solar or nuclear or this? I don't know. We won't do anything right now. We're making money with what we're doing. So we're paralyzed, or we know what to do, but there are strong vested interests saying don't do it because I'm making too much money in the short term doing the destructive things, or it just is complicated and hasn't been thought out properly because this is something absolutely new. It was rather straightforward to build a coal plant, but it's not so straightforward perhaps to build offshore wind or solar fields or something else because of storage or other issues. So there are just complexities. But that's the second big category of challenge that we face, which is this economic environmental collision course, which again needs analysis and then needs to ask, how deep is the problem? And for me, and how solvable is the problem? So the climate crisis is very deep, but it's also rather solvable. And there are some puzzles, definitely. What should big ocean tankers run on? Should it be hydrogen fuel cells? Should it be ammonia? Should it be hydrogen combustion? I'm not an engineer. I've heard the arguments from the engineers. I want them to fight it out. I want them to try different approaches, but clearly we should be trying these technology lines. The third big challenge, which is a challenge of time immemorial, is that we seem to have a very hard time to stop killing each other. So war becomes ever more dangerous because the weapons become ever more destructive. And now we're technologically so smart that we figured out how to destroy the whole humanity. Damn it. If we weren't so smart, we wouldn't have this trouble. But a few geniuses figured out you could make nuclear fission work to make a bomb. By the way, there were probably 50 people in the world that understood that. And they figured it out, and then they gave it to a world of idiots. So we have a lot of dumb people who are in charge of nuclear weapons, and they were made by a few geniuses. That's our problem. So this is our third issue, which is how to stay peaceful and cooperative. To my mind, these are the three big issues that we face, which is how to be fair and decent to people who are suffering, how to make sure that we're not self-destructive because our economic system is actually a complicated set of incentives that doesn't get things right. And there's no magic in how we have organized our economic life to handle issues like greenhouse gases, which weren't in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and are not part of the things that a free market can solve, and so forth. And the third is this interminable problem that if you read human history, we've been fighting with each other most of the time, but there are also glimmers of hope that there are long periods of peace, and we also have institutions for peace, just like we have institutions for war. One of the things that makes me quite optimistic about China's rise is that China has been much more peaceful in its history than just about any other region of the world. And the amount of interstate war of China over the last 2,000 years is actually quite low. It's basically been wars of pastoralists coming from the north and sedentary farmers trying to fight them off. And that's been most of China's wars for 2,000 years. If you look at Europe's wars, it was just kill each other across the divide for 1,000 years, nonstop. So China at least has a peaceful tradition, and I think it fits actually with this idea of harmonious society, with the idea of global civilizations and so forth. I'm quite an optimist, I have to say, about that, because I think it actually there's a deep rootedness. So that's all we have to do. End poverty, protect the environment, stop killing with each other. All right? So, thank you. No, okay. So what do we do? To my mind, the basic thing is we should think hard about each of those things and then come up with plans. That's the most basic idea. That sounds so dumb. Why am I saying that after 40 years? Don't I have anything more intelligent to say? And the thing is that the way that our social systems work is not to think and then solve these things. And that's very interesting. Our economic system is designed around a different principle, which is let people do what they want, get rich, go find your job, go buy what you want, but not solve problems. So in economic land, it's not oriented towards solving problems. It's oriented towards doing your thing. Businesses are supposed to go make profits, and we're supposed to be good consumers, and we're supposed to be smart in the job that we pursue. But at least in market economics, which became the dominant ideology of the Anglo-Saxon world and then the world, it isn't to solve problems, it's go do your thing. So don't expect the answers to these problems to come from the economic sphere or from the business community. It's not their job. Their job is to run a business. It's to make money. So that's problem number one, that we don't think in the economic sphere about end goals. We're supposed to just do our thing. And then politicians. In most politics, it's not about solving problems. It's about maintaining power. And that's even the goal. And you have experts on maintaining power. All the politicians have little Machiavellis around them, handing them, this is what you need to do to stay in power. And that's your goal. And so politics, at least in my country, has very little to do with any goals. I don't know what any American goals are. We have no goals. We have some heroes, our founding fathers. We love the Constitution. We like the July 4th Independence Day, but we have no goals. And even when I hear Dr. Zhao talk about China's goals, you could not have that in the United States, stating those goals, because that's socialism. You're not allowed to have goals. So politics is not oriented towards solving problems. Really, it's management of power, competition for power, holding on to power, benefiting from power. And so we don't see from our governments most of the time these big goals and how to solve them. I really think China's been different in this period, the last 40 years, from most other governments. And I think the success is a result of that, actually, that it's really, and why? Well, I think this is a very interesting question, but a few countries at a few times have very clear goals, maybe because of survival, maybe because of their past history, maybe because they have a successful neighbor, so they want to imitate the success, maybe like in Singapore, because a genius came, Lee Kuan Yew, and he had a very, very clear idea. And really, Singapore, it is a case of a very clear, brilliant thinker who just guided things for quite a while, like Plato's philosopher king. But most of the time, this is not how politics is. So we don't see a lot of this problem solving coming from governments. And the third thing is, in my country, which became the most powerful country in the world for the last 75 years militarily, they really think that fighting wars is a big part of what governance is about. They're crazy and dangerous and could get us all killed. So that third category of just peaceful cooperation does not come easily. Every day we read something hateful about China in the American newspapers now. Every single day. I just read today, China has the Global Civilizations Initiative. Wonderful. You talked about it. Today I just read, this is terrible. This is, China's out to take over the world through this. Now, honestly, this is a mindset that is very, very deep, probably ingrained evolutionarily in us also, because there probably was a time when whoever could control the next water hole survived, and whoever didn't survive, and it was us or them. And that's not how the world is right now. It's not us or them. We don't need to take over any other place to have well-being, period. There's no crisis of living room. There is only the crisis of understanding, don't kill the other side. Okay, so what do we do? Again, just to conclude, we need to think clearly. Excuse me. That's a technical term about American politics. So we need really to put serious ideas forward in detail. And that's the purpose of what we're after. And two specific pathways that we're really focusing on right now is one is the energy transition, because there's only a quarter century and an energy system's really complicated. You have to have a power grid. We have to convert all the vehicles to electric or to hydrogen or to some other non-emitting source. The building sector has to be far more efficient. Industry emits a lot of greenhouse gases. Deforestation. In other words, all of the getting to net zero is quite a complicated challenge with lots of moving parts, and it's a lot of money. Not more than an energy system costs, but an energy system is trillions of dollars a year, and so it's worth getting right. So that's the first of the pathways. And the second is the land use and ocean use, because we're really so close to destroying everything irreversibly. When the species is lost, it's never coming back. And when the ecosystems are degraded, many of them never return. And if we pass climate thresholds, we're just going to spend the next century in disaster of calamitous sea level rises, storms, heat waves, and so on. So we're very close to that. So those are the two main pathways that we are really focusing on. The biological and its association with food production and with other agricultural production. And for this region, that's central, because this is a biodiversity Garden of Eden, and also a biodiversity threatened region intensively. All this beauty, and it's being torn down. And it can happen so fast because economies are very, very large right now, and demands. China could deforest this country just by its demands for tropical hardwoods without a problem, unless you take care. So those are the two areas that we really want to focus on. And the final point that I want to say is, again, about this third category of cooperation. It happens that when you look technically at an energy program or at a ecosystem program, no country can do this by itself. Nothing can be done other than at the local level, but plans need to be transnational without question. So there's a lot of local action, but they have to be part of a broader framework. And that's why this is an ASEAN workshop, because ASEAN countries are not only together on the map and not only physical neighbors, but have work to do together, because ASEAN countries cannot achieve their goals without working together. And so we need to do this at a transnational planning level. That's hard because there are no elected transnational officials anywhere. All transnational organizations are weak because none of them has an army. None of them has political leaders. We're organized at the national level in the world. That's where the physical force lies. And that's where the politics generally lies. And yet we have global and regional problems that need addressing urgently. The Mekong is not going to be saved one country at a time. It's going to be saved by China, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, Vietnam working together. Without question, there's no way to do that one country at a time. It's got to be done in the watershed. The energy system for Malaysia absolutely needs to be integrated with the rest of the region. And those regional institutions are weak politically and organizationally, and they need to be strengthened considerably. And then the question of what region is the right region for this. We're dealing with ASEAN because it's a crucial, established regional entity. But I said yesterday, and I'll say it again, I think for the energy sector, RCEP is even more appropriate. That's adding in ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. The United States would have a fit, by the way. I'll be done in 1 minute. The US would have a fit. You're cooperating with China? Well, my strong advice to you is cooperate with China closely. And my strong advice to Australia is don't build a submarine base, cooperate with China. And let's not waste money on nuclear submarines right now and raise the tension more. So my own advice is that broader group, and I hope India joins that group, and then we've got a lot of the world together in a way that could actually solve the problems. So sorry for the long rambling, except I believe that all of these problems are solvable. I believe that universities have a unique and extremely important role to play in this, because this is what we should be doing. Training, teaching, educating, researching, policy analysis, and really trying to make politics work the way that it should, which is for the common good. Thank you.
You mentioned the conflict in Ukraine. Of course, now it's not so much in spotlight as more of the news concentrates on what is going on between Israel, Hamas, and the situation in the Gaza Strip. So suddenly we see that Ukraine is not number one, at least not in the foreign policy topics. Do you see any possible way out of the conflict? I mean, a peaceful way out, or at least a satisfactory way out of this conflict? As you mentioned, this is really a proxy war. Of course, the Ukraine is a pawn simply in the game, and in effect, it's a war of Russia against NATO, especially against the United States. So, is there a possible change, for example, coming with the next election in the United States, or is it just wishful thinking?
Well, the thing we should understand, if you're playing poker and you have a lousy hand, and each time it comes to you, you raise the ante. And when the opponent matches you, meets your meets you, you up the ante, even though your hand is lousy. Maybe you're bluffing, or maybe you don't know how to play poker. But that is what the West has done with Russia. Because the West said, we're going to expand NATO to Ukraine. And at first, Russia didn't say, oh, we're going to conquer the territory. Russia just said, don't do that. We respect Ukraine's borders. And all we want is a long-term lease for our naval fleet in Sevastopol. And that was what Viktor Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, delivered between 2010 and 2013. A long-term lease for Russia and neutrality. Okay, we don't want to join NATO. It's, we're in between. Then the United States and Europe really helped to overthrow Yanukovych. We should be clear about this. In February 2014, the United States played a direct role in the overthrow of Yanukovych. And they brought in an anti-Russian government. And at that point, President Putin said, okay, we're not going to let Crimea fall into NATO hands. So we'll organize a referendum, and the people of Crimea, no doubt, overwhelmingly were Russian and wanted to be part of Russia, and voted to become part of Russia. The West said, no, this is completely unacceptable. Then the Russian regions of eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, of course, said, we don't like this new government. It's very radical. It's very anti-Russian. It's trying to cancel Russian culture and Russian language. We want autonomy. And the two breakaway republics of Lugansk and Donetsk took place. And the Ukrainian government attacked them as renegade provinces, but it militarily attacked them. And then came the Minsk agreements, Minsk I and Minsk II, to stop the fighting. And Minsk II, in particular, was endorsed by the UN Security Council. And Russia didn't say, we're going to take the Donbass. Russia just said, honor the Minsk II agreement, which gives autonomy to these regions and respect for the Russian language and Russian culture. Pretty reasonable, actually. But the Ukrainians and the Americans said, no way. We're not going to honor an agreement, even though the UN Security Council adopted it. And so Minsk II was never implemented. And interestingly, Chancellor Merkel of Germany was supposed to be a guarantor of Minsk II. And then she admitted in a press conference a year ago, oh, we didn't really mean it. It just gave time for Ukraine to strengthen its defenses and so forth. Well, this is very cynical and very destructive. But the reason I mention it is Russia was not calling for Ukrainian territory, except we raised the stakes in this poker game. And then Russia said, okay, we'll take Crimea. And the United States said, and we want autonomy for the Russian regions. No, we raised the stakes, no autonomy. And then Russia said at the end of 1991, look, this situation is not controlled. Minsk is not being enforced. NATO is still intending to enlarge to Ukraine. This is the last chance. We demand negotiations with the United States. And President Putin put on the table a draft agreement with the U.S. on December 17, 2021. And the United States said, no, we're not negotiating any of that with you. That's arrogance. They did it again. I called the White House at the end of 2021 and spoke with senior official and said, negotiate with Russia, avoid the war. Oh, don't worry, Professor Sachs. Of course, the United States rejected negotiations and the special military operation started. Now, this is also very interesting. at the time of the special military operation, the two regions, Lugansk and Donetsk, claimed independence. Russia did not annex them until September 2022. They claimed independence. Of course, the United States said no, but immediately Zelensky said, okay, we can negotiate with Russia. And in March 2022, there were negotiations, and they were actually going to reach an outcome of Ukrainian neutrality and an end to the war. And then what happened? The United States stepped in and said, no, don't do that. We don't accept that. Well, how stupid is that? You have a losing hand, but they raised the ante one more time. Now, why did they do that? Because they're basically ignorant. In this case, they didn't understand how bad their hand was. They looked at their cards and they said, we're going to impose economic sanctions, and this will bring Russia to its knees. And we will ship HIMARS missiles, and this will destroy the Russian military. This is a fantasy world of these people, these neocons in Washington. So they raised the stakes one more time. They said no to a negotiated peace. They said no to Ukrainian neutrality. And the war continued. And now where are we in this advanced stage of the war? Russia is absolutely destroying one Ukrainian army after another. This is obvious. And the much talked about Ukrainian counteroffensive that was supposed to take place in June 2023 and reach the Sea of Azov. Of course, it didn't reach anything. It didn't do anything other than kill tens of thousands of Ukrainians and cost an unbelievable amount of money in destroyed tanks, weapon systems, artillery, everything. So it's been a disaster. These are the worst poker players I've ever seen. All they do with a lousy hand is keep raising the stakes and keep losing.
Maybe now they are trying to shift focus, shift attention to Gaza or maybe to some other conflicts, because actually when you are losing in one, then you can try to induce more chaos.
You asked me a question which I didn't answer. I gave a long answer.
If there is a way out.
No, but you asked me a question, what to do. And the point I would make is the first thing we should do is stop raising the ante, Stop saying, oh, we're going to defeat them. It's easy. We're going to beat them. No, Ukraine's not going to defeat Russia. And the more that this goes on, the more dead Ukrainians there are. That's just the most basic point. And the whole society has been so profoundly wounded because millions and millions of Ukrainians are in Europe or are in Russia, and hundreds of thousands are dead because of this. So the population has collapsed, and there aren't young people anymore. Now they want to draft kids and young women because they've run out of soldiers. It's terrible. And so we need to stop raising the ante. Now, what would that mean? We need to negotiate. We need to say first, okay, NATO is not enlarging, but Russia, you have to stop taking more and more Ukraine. And what the Russians are going to say at this point is, okay, we keep the following territories. And we're going to have to negotiate over that, because the idea that, no, we don't make any concessions, you're just going to be defeated, is going to end up destroying all of Ukraine. It's raising the stakes on a lousy hand. And we should recognize that we are going to need a political outcome right now, not the one we wanted, but we were so dumb not to take a better deal a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that now we're in a situation where we're not going to get exactly what we, quote, want. But to continue the fighting would absolutely destroy even more.
What worries me most is actually that really the lives of Ukrainians are just taken as a casualty, as something not even worth speaking about.
They don't even talk about it. The leadership is absolutely gross. You know, I'm sure that Zelensky is in a very hard place, but all he talks about right now is throwing more lives to the graves. Frankly, no strategy, no self-awareness, no situational awareness. Okay, it's very sad because the United States talked him out of a peace agreement in March 2022. That was Zelensky's chance, and he lost it. He was inexperienced. You know, when the United States comes and tells you, we have your back, you tend to believe it if you're inexperienced. I tried to tell him, by the way, I really tried to tell the Ukrainians, look, I'm an old guy. I've been through lots of U.S. wars, Vietnam War, Nicaragua, the Gulf Wars, Syria. They never win. Are you kidding? Do you really want to end up like Afghanistan? And they didn't believe me. They just thought, oh, you're a Putin apologist. So they didn't want to hear any of this. But I was telling them the hard facts about American wars, and they didn't want to hear it.
Besides Russia, I'm not sure that Ukraine actually is such a big topic in American policy. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, it's
maybe
definitely
Israel.
You know, it's a big focus of the political class still, the military-industrial complex and the White House. Maybe for just political reasons that Biden doesn't want to admit what a lousy poker player he is. But the point is, for the American people, they've had enough. There's no groundswell of support. People don't want that. They want to stop this thing. And so in that sense, you're absolutely right. Typically, the public doesn't have much say in this. We have almost no public debate. But Biden's popularity is really collapsing. And if the unhappiness with Biden's foreign policy is very, very clear. So maybe even public opinion is going to start playing a role because we're now in an election year.
I would like to ask you to clear the position on China, because when I look both at the Republicans or at the Democrats, I would say that their views on China are very similar. So they actually have very hostile views towards China. Now there was a summit, APEC, where both presidents, Biden and Xi Jinping, met. Do you see any decline in tension, any hopes that actually the relations, they're probably not going to be friendly, but let's say at least stabilize and would be less threatening for the world?
I'll tell you an interesting thing. When President Xi came to this APEC summit in San Francisco, he met 200 U.S. business leaders, and they gave him a standing ovation. I don't think they would give an American president a standing ovation, but they gave President Xi a standing ovation. Why? China's their biggest market. They both produce in China, they sell in China, they make a lot of money in China, and they want normal relations. What is happening is two things. One, we have a kind of security class in America who are all about American dominance, American hegemony, America being number one. It's a very strange group of people. But this is our foreign policy establishment. Then we have politicians who basically think that, and it's very particular, Trump in 2016 won the election by winning swing states in the middle of America, in the American Midwest, which is our industrial zone. And he won it by saying, China took your jobs away. And when he made narrow victories in those states, the Democrats said, oh, we have to attack China in order to compete politically with Trump. So there are two reasons for the anti-China China sentiment in the United States. One, and in the political class, one is this idea of America being the only dominant country. Well, I mean, unless you're playing a board game like the game of Risk, you don't get to be the dominant country in the world when there are other big countries around. So this is arrogance, again, very misguided. Then there is this protectionist politics, which tries to appeal to a few swing states in the U.S. elections. The upshot of this is that the political class, both Democrats and Republicans, are pretty united against China, pretty ignorant from my experience. They don't know China. They don't know Chinese history. They don't have any perspective. They play a dangerous game, like when our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, flew to Taiwan. So stupid. Sorry. Just why do you want to provoke another superpower?
Thank you for saying that, because we have same representatives who are also provoking China in this kind.
Okay, don't provoke China. Be respectful. Just have normal relations. Don't provoke a superpower. Why? What is in it to poke a superpower? It's stupid. People should think. If there's even if you think there's a bully, which China's not, but if you think there's a bully in the schoolyard and you're a little kid and you think they're the bully, is it really smart to go poking them and say, "You're a bully, I hate you"? No, you're going to get hurt in the end. So you need some common sense. And China's not even bullying. China is just big, successful, dynamic, actually a good trade partner for Europe. So we should treat it normally, respectfully. And the U.S. anxieties should not be Europe's anxieties. This is another area where European politicians are just repeating the words of American politicians. And I know behind the scenes, although it's obvious, why does van der Leyen repeat words almost like Biden? Because she feels that her job is to be with the United States. Maybe she hopes the United States appoints her as the Secretary General of NATO or something. I don't know what it is. No, but that's what she hopes maybe. So this is where Europe makes a big mistake. Just like it did make a big mistake in Ukraine, it would make a big mistake of trying to make an enemy out of China. That's a completely ridiculous losing proposition.
My last question, because our time is coming up, I have to reflect one very current event you already mentioned, and that's the elections in Argentina.
Yes.
Because let's say that the elected president is unusual personality. How do you view this situation? Is there a danger for BRICS or maybe for other Latin American countries with his very strange suggestions as for foreign policy, as for economics?
Yeah, of course, time will tell. One thing is he won the presidency but has no control over the Congress. His small parties, and at least for the moment, doesn't have any kind of governing coalition in the Congress. So maybe his ability to do things will require a much broader coalition of forces, and that could be a constraint. But let me just say first, Argentina is a country that has been unstable for its whole history, going back to the 1820s, ever since independence. Argentina has messed up more currencies, had more inflation, and more instability than any other place on the entire planet. This guy won not because of what he says, but because of disgust with the outgoing government, which was delivering inflation of triple digits, more than 100%, you can't really win an election when inflation is triple digit. And I know Argentina quite well, and actually worked with the finance minister just before this one. And he was doing a good job, and he ended up being not forced out. He resigned, unfortunately. But he resigned because his own, I would say, corrupt politicians in his own party were rejecting the normal policies that he was trying to promote. So Argentina is now in yet another cycle of instability. All my professional career as an economist, I've been watching Argentina in amazement, because it's not an impoverished country by any means, and it's got huge natural wealth and very smart people, well-educated class of people, but it has made such a political mess repeatedly, and this could be yet another one. I don't want to say on the first day after the election of this guy that he'll really govern the way he campaigned, because sometimes they become a lot more responsible, but it could be that that he is what he says he is, in which case Argentina is going to face some real troubles. It's regrettable, because I'm a fan of the BRICS. I would like to see them work. Argentina is a new member of the BRICS group. Whether this guy stays in or out of the BRICS or gets kicked out of the BRICS, everything remains to be seen. But I only hope that this guy was making this as a persona, not as a real politics, because his real politics, if delivered this way, would be very, very detrimental to Argentina.
You have just spent, I think, 1 year in Europe, in Vienna, and
Yes.
in some other places. What is the most important take you have from this stay in Europe? What's your dominant impression of the state of Europe?
I was very disappointed, because most of Europe's leaders are right now simply following whatever the United States says. And whether this is because of their belief in Europe's security, whether it's their belief that the U.S. will punish them if they deviate from the line, the state of European politics is quite bad. And the war has made things worse, because Europe is with a dominant narrative, like the United States, that is basically given by the U.S. security establishment and then repeated in the mainstream media in Europe. So it was, at a political level, really disappointing. At a personal level, it was wonderful. Vienna is a fantastic place. It is the result of decades of social democratic philosophy and ethos and social housing, and we had a fabulous time. And I also came to admire more and more the wise decision of both the Soviet Union and Austria in 1955 to make a very good deal, that the Soviets would leave Austria and the Austrians would declare neutrality, and that this would be the basis going forward. And it proved its great worth, and I tried to sell that approach for free to give the advice to Ukraine repeatedly, but they didn't understand that it's much better to be a neutral Austria than a NATO aspirant partner of the United States. As Henry Kissinger famously said, to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. And Ukraine has believed that the U.S. is going to provide security, and what the U.S. is providing is the dismemberment of Ukraine.
Your Austrian neutrality makes us Swiss a little bit proud, because in the constitution of Austria it says they want to have a neutrality Swiss style.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. I mean, that Switzerland was the role model for neutrality in Austria. What's your relationship with Switzerland?
And this is, of course, extremely smart, and it served Switzerland very well. It served Austria very well, and ironically, it served Sweden and Finland very well. And they abandoned this this year, shockingly naively, thinking that Russia's about to invade Finland or Sweden. No. And all of the benefits of neutrality they gave up overnight because of these right-wing parties that don't understand or pretend not to understand the current geopolitics.
Even in Switzerland, there are people in the establishment who think that neutrality has to be given up, or neutrality has to be made more flexible, that Switzerland can deliver weapons to one party in the war. What do you say about that? I mean, what's your take on that? I mean, should Switzerland give up neutrality? Would that be a wise course?
No. There's nothing more to add. Switzerland's one of the most successful countries of modern history. Why would you give up the basis of success?
Ja, as Goethe said, nichts ist schwerer zu ertragen als eine Folge von guten Tagen. Good days are hard to bear, and sometimes if you're very successful, you start to forget what made you successful.
Well, it's interesting. Every day I walk by Goethe on the Ringstrasse in Vienna, because he's got a big statue just near the opera house. And so I paid respect to Goethe every day.
Okay. You have been commenting, of course, the war in Ukraine in the recent months extensively. How do you assess the situation at the moment? Give us a brief oversight of your perception.
I think it's probably accurate, or roughly accurate, that about 40,000 Ukrainians have died in the last 2 months of what is a failed counteroffensive promoted by the United States. So this has been a disastrous period. Ukraine will not achieve on the battlefield its goals. This was clear from the very beginning, but the U.S. has always said otherwise. And remember, I'm 68 years old, so I've heard the fairy tales of U.S. generals for more than 6 decades. They always say, yes, success is just around the corner. This next offensive is going to be great. The surge is going to be decisive, and so forth. So I've heard this so many times in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Nicaragua, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and heard it again in Ukraine. What's very sad is that Ukraine is being destroyed in this process because the U.S. has wanted to push Ukraine to NATO, and Russia, for completely predictable and understandable reasons, said no. And the United States believed that Russia was bluffing, or that, if not bluffing, that it had no alternative but to bend to the U.S. will. And this has not been the case. And Biden is not a very clever man, unfortunately, and his team is not very clever. Obama was more clever than Biden. And Obama knew in 2014, though Obama helped to start this disaster when the U.S. helped to overthrow Yanukovych, Obama knew at that time, don't go deeper into this. Because, as he said in an interview, Russia has escalatory dominance. Whatever we do, Russia will escalate. And the reason is, for Russia, this is existential. For the United States, it's nice. Wouldn't it be nice if Ukraine were in NATO, we would control the Black Sea. That's nice, but for Russia, it's absolutely existential. And so Obama already understood in 2014, don't escalate because Russia will continue to escalate. You can't bluff Russia out of this. Biden, who's not very clever, just thought, well, what will Putin do? We'll just keep pushing. And when Putin put on the table in December 2021 a draft agreement for security arrangements between the U.S. and Russia, by the way, I called the White House to say, negotiate. This is absolutely negotiable. I was told, no, we're not going to negotiate. And the U.S. told Russia, no, not interested in negotiating. NATO is none of your business. It was literally the line. And Putin said, it is my business and has shown it. And this is a complete disaster for Ukraine. Probably the population has declined by maybe 10 million from emigres on the one hand, or the Russia-controlled territory on the other hand. And the bloodbath continues. And NATO has, I won't even say NATO, this is a small group in the U.S. leadership. They have no answer, but they have the election coming up in November 2024. So they think they need to continue this so as not to show weakness or defeat. This is where we are right now. It's a complete tragedy for Ukraine.
How will it play out? I mean, it's always hard to say, of course, to look into the future, but what is the most probable outcome you see in this war?
There will be ongoing large-scale killing and destruction until honesty prevails. And honesty will mean that the U.S. will be clear that NATO enlargement to Ukraine is not going to take place and not going to happen, and it's not an objective, and then the fighting will stop. And when the fighting stops, there will be major territorial issues. One, I think, was fated from the beginning, and that is that Crimea will remain in Russian hands, as it was and has continued to be Russia's naval base in Sevastopol since 1783. It's not going to Ukraine, other than it's not going to Ukraine, period. And then the issues of the Donbass and Kherson district and Zaporizhia. This is really a mess right now, because in December 2021, we should remember Russia was making no territorial claims, even for the Donbass. What Russia was calling for was honoring the Minsk agreements. And the U.S. stupidly and Ukraine stupidly wouldn't honor agreements that had been signed and backed unanimously by the UN Security Council. Well, Russia is now dismantling the country geographically, and with so many losses on the Russian side, the belief that, well, okay, we'll just go back to where we were is a little naive. So this is a mess. I don't have any clear answer. What I've said every day from December 2021 until now is sit down and negotiate, because it's getting worse. And in the meantime, Ukrainians are dying at a rate of maybe 1,000 a day right now, or 1,000 dead and seriously wounded. And this is absolutely disastrous.
The dominant narrative, even in Switzerland, in the German-speaking part of Europe, I don't know, probably also in the United States, is that Putin is trying to reassemble the Soviet Union. His plan is to create a greater Russia, and to negotiate with Putin would be appeasement policy, which was doomed against Hitler. These historical analogies are being made. Why is this narrative wrong in your eyes?
Well, because the real context is that the American empire is the one that keeps expanding, or the intention of it. And by, that's a provocative phrase that Americans are not allowed to say. But the American military alliance, NATO, is the active agent here of expansion. And this counters all that was said to Gorbachev in 1990. It's a direct violation of common sense, as well as commitments that were made back in 1990, that as the Soviet Union dismantled the Warsaw Pact, NATO would not take advantage of that in any way. And of course, the famous expression was not 1 inch eastward. Mm-hmm. And as soon as the Soviet Union ended, I was actually in the room in the Kremlin when that happened, because I was advisor to Boris Yeltsin. So this is, for me, not only history books, but being there. The United States, unbeknownst, of course, to me and to the world at the time, because everything is done secretly, said, okay, now we start expanding NATO. And from the early 1990s onward, this was set in motion. And our top diplomats warned repeatedly, don't do that. Our greatest diplomat of the age, George Kennan, after all, the author of Containment itself in 1947, said, do not expand NATO. Our Secretary of Defense at the time, William Perry, said, do not do this. Our ambassador to the Soviet Union, Jack Matlock, a wonderful diplomat, said, do not do this. This will start us down a path of new confrontation. What's interesting is that for the first few years, the first wave of expansion, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, I think Russia was very unhappy, but said, okay, that's Central Europe. But then the next swath under George W. Bush Jr. was, of course, right against the Black Sea, Bulgaria, Romania, the Baltic states, Slovakia and Slovenia, 7 in one wave. The Russians said, stop this already. And Putin went to the Munich Security Conference in 2007. People should read the speech. Of course, not only do they not read the speech, our mainstream media absolutely tried to deflect us from any history, from any memory, from any context. But Putin said, stop expanding. You promised us no expansion. Now you keep expanding. And this is extraordinarily dangerous for our national security, what you're doing. So what was the U.S. response? In 2008, George W. Bush Jr. insisted that NATO will go not only to Ukraine, but to Georgia. Okay, now it turns out this was part of a timeline that was already deeply set. This wasn't just George W. Bush Jr., though he didn't have to follow through. Zbig Brzezinski explained all of this in Foreign Affairs magazine in 1997 in an article called Strategy for Eurasia. He even gave the timetable. He said Ukraine's membership will come between 2005 and 2010. And if you're experienced in U.S. politics, an article in Foreign Affairs like that is not just some author's thinking. It's a reflection of what is in train. Little bit trial balloon, but mainly explanation of the timeline. Now, in 2008, European leaders were aghast at what Bush had done. And some of them talked to me. And they told me.
Angela Merkel.
Not Angela Merkel personally, no.
But she said at the time, if Ukraine would be part of NATO, this would be a cause of war for Russia. Even Merkel said it.
Exactly. So this was all known. And what is so sad about the European leaders, is none of them tells the truth right now. They're all so scared of the United States or of their public or of the ability to manipulate the mass media and the perception from below or to speak out of line. But I know what they said because they said it to me. They said it to me personally. And by the way, just as recently as a few weeks ago, one of Europe's top leaders, I said to him, I won't go farther to say who, but I said, you know, the day Biden says NATO's not enlarging, then we really can get to the end of the war. And he said to me, I agree with you completely. And then he said exactly the opposite the next day, by the way, in public. So I know it from my own view. So this story, just to finish the story, the disaster, the fuse was lit in 2008, but then the U.S. cannot stop playing games. That's the biggest problem. U.S. foreign policy is covert. It's not that you can't figure it out, but it's secret, it's deniable. And so what happens in 2014 in February? The United States, together with right-wing nationalists in Ukraine, work together to overthrow Yanukovych. Clear as can be. And not only that, thanks to the services of Russia, we even have it on tape with Victoria Nuland talking to U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Piat about who the next government will be. Basically 4 weeks before Yanukovych is violently overthrown. And they pick the next prime minister and explain why. It can't be Klitschko, it's got to be this one. And it just went down that way. And our newspapers, oh, they won't say a word about it. It's on tape. Oh, that doesn't matter. We can ignore it. We can ignore everything. So that's when the explosion came. The war started with the overthrow of the Yanukovych government. Now, oh, so many people, Sachs, you know, what a Putin apologist, what a conspiracy theorist. Of course, people, if you don't look a little bit or people don't tell you things, then you don't know. But let me advise people, just for example, there's a very nice book written by a very fine scholar in 2017 called Covert Regime Change. And it's about U.S. foreign policy from 1947 to 1989. And it documents 64 covert regime change operations of the U.S. government. So that's the business of the U.S. government, overthrowing other governments. They're called covert, but there's a lot of trace. I've been actually in places where governments have been overthrown. I watched, and then I see that the New York Times won't even report the story because it's a game from the U.S. point of view. So in February 2014, the U.S. again engaged in a regime change operation and thought we can get away with it. Now we have a pro-NATO government. We've just overthrown the neutral government. Now we have a pro-NATO government. And immediately the new government says, yeah, we want to join NATO. And immediately the arms flows start from the United States, billions of dollars of arms flows. And this continues through Trump. It continues through the uprisings in the Donbass. It continues with Russia taking back Crimea. And then in 2021, we have a new president who some of us thought would be sane and responsible. He's probably sane, but he's completely irresponsible. And 3 times in 2021, the United States government recommitted to Ukraine's membership in NATO at the highest levels in big security documents, as well as in the NATO summit in 2021. And that's when Putin put on the table at the end of 2021 a draft agreement for new security arrangements between the US and Russia. And Putin kept saying, by the way, look, you're putting Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. They're a few minutes from Moscow. What are you putting in those missile chambers? We don't even know, because you backed out of the ABM treaty, you backed out of the INF treaty. And so Putin's got a point. And now the US wants to move up to the 2,300 kilometer border with Russia. And for those who still think that this is, anyone who reads anything knows that this is a 30 years process. This is not about Putin reconstructing the Russian Empire. That's a nice little joke told by the US security state, as opposed to any of the things I've just described. But if you just go online and look at the Russian National Security Council meeting of February 21st, 2022, you get a perfectly plain explanation of what this military operation is about, because Putin goes around the room and calls on everybody, and calls on Lavrov, among others, and says, Minister Lavrov, what is the situation with our proposals for security arrangements? And Lavrov says, Mr. President, we put them on the table, and the United States has given us the formal notice that it will not negotiate on these points, and that as a formal principle, the United States will not discuss NATO enlargement with Russia because it's none of our business, because that is the formal foreign policy doctrine of the United States of America. Well, I can't think of a stupider one, by the way, to say that NATO enlargement, with all that it entails, up to Russia's border is none of Russia's business, so we don't even discuss it with Russia. Well, you might think a war could break out as a result of that, and it has.